The modern art revolution that later critics would nickname Gothic began in Paris and spread rapidly, first through France and then beyond into England, Germany, and Italy. Like the Romanesque style, Gothic architecture and art would change features more than a little as it traveled. At this period in history, England was heavily influenced by developments in France. Its new ruling elite, the Normans, came from northwest France, although the Normans themselves were, as the name suggests, originally Vikings or Northmen. But the Norman rulers held lands in both England and Normandy and crossed back and forth across the Channel rather frequently. Moreover, as I mentioned in my last lecture, the late Norman cathedrals at Caen and Durham already employed the most important Gothic architectural innovations. Well, I hope you've already watched one last clip from A White Garment of Churches and learned something about the distinctive English Gothic style. This shows up, by the way, on AP exams every few years as an essay question. 2 of the oral essay questions that we'll be hearing next month address the English Gothic style. But before we look at the so-called perpendicular Gothic, I want you to watch a clip from a video that I just saw for the first time, probably because it aired very recently on BBC. What I really like about this video clip, and what I want you to think about, is how it discusses the religious and intellectual underpinnings of Gothic art. The focus on Christ as a human being who understands our suffering, and the belief that reason could actually reinforce belief. You'll also get a good review of Romanesque architecture. The discussion you just saw relates to all Gothic art, not just Gothic art in England. Anselm himself represented the internationalism of the High Middle Ages. He was born in Italy, educated in what is now France, and appointed as an archbishop in Norman-ruled England. But Gothic did take a somewhat different turn in England. England's greatest Gothic cathedral at Salisbury was begun the same year as the High Gothic Cathedral at Amiens. So what obvious Gothic features do you see at Salisbury Cathedral? Well, the heavily decorated facade is Gothic, as are the tall lancet windows in the westwork. But what looks different? Well, note that the facade, the westwork, is a kind of false front. It's wider than the nave behind it. Nor is the facade as tall as Amiens or other high Gothic French cathedrals, including the infamously dangerous and still unfinished cathedral at Beauvais. The English, or more accurately the Normans, since they still spoke an early form of French, were not as obsessed with height except in their spectacular crossing towers. For that reason, the flying buttresses are really more decorative features than they are engineering necessities. So let's look at some side-by-side comparisons of Amiens and Salisbury. These photos do a little better job of capturing the greater height of the Amiens Cathedral and a much more imposing crossing towers of Salisbury. When I think of Norman churches in England, I think of spires. They dominate the landscape for miles around. These comparisons are easier to make using floor plans. Sorry that these aren't bigger. I did not want to mess with all the helpful red lines that I'm hoping will appear now. Oh, and there they are hopping in. The photo on the bottom right is the Google Earth image of Amiens Cathedral, which makes it easier to see the apse with its radiating chapels. The image on top is actually a painting of Salisbury Cathedral by one of my favorite painters, Turner, whom you'll see a lot of in the next semester. Turner painted Salisbury Cathedral from the east, so you can see the flat rectangular apse more clearly. Many French Cistercian churches also had a similar flat apse, reflecting Bernard of Clairvaux's criticisms that churches had become distractingly ornate and complex. He didn't like all those little radiating chapels. And we have a few more goodies there. Here's a better look at the cathedral's flat apse and at the painting. Both churches have a 3-story nave elevation, 4-part rib vaults, and compound piers. These are easier to see in the photo of the Amiens nave. But at Salisbury, the pier colonnettes, or those slender columns that are engaged with the pier, stop at the springing or the bottom of the arcade arch. At Amiens, they soar all the way to the rib vaulting on the ceiling. At Salisbury, the rib vaults rise from the triforium, or second level. Oops, let's try to go back there, sorry. The result is a much more horizontal emphasis at Salisbury, if you will, a somewhat more down-to-earth appearance. Maybe the Anglo-Saxons were already rubbing off on the Normans. On the other hand, notice that the carvings on the triforium are very similar. In the early 13th century, English Gothic churches developed increasingly complex internal decoration. This image is not in your book, but I thought it provided an especially clear view of the complex rib vault and the elaborate tracery around the windows that characterized English Gothic style. Do you remember from your homework video what this kind of rib vault was called? It's called fan vaulting. And here's an image of the strainer arches that you saw in the homework video from Wells Cathedral. Notice how these arches also emphasize the horizontal as much as the vertical. And on the ceiling, you see that complex fan rib vaulting. If you see that, you are looking at an English church. Big hint on if you get it on an essay question. And here is the delicately and ornately decorated cloister of Gloucester Cathedral with its famous fan vaulting. By the way, if you think this corridor looks strangely familiar, yep, several of the Hogwarts scenes were filmed in Gloucester Cathedral. It's been a boom business for the cathedral, which now offers Harry Potter tours. Here's a quick home video of one of these tours interspersed with a few scenes from the Harry Potter movies filmed at Gloucester Cathedral. And here is the Chapel of Henry VII at Westminster Abbey, with its even more over-the-top decorative vaulting. I should note that this is not actually architectural vaulting. It's really those rounded diaphragm vaults, the arch-shaped vaults across the nave that support the roof, as they did in Romanesque churches. These rib vaults are pretty much there for show. This chapel also contained the tomb of Henry VII and his wife. Elaborately decorated tombs were a feature of later Gothic churches and would carry over into Renaissance and Baroque churches as well. Notice the date. Something that's really confusing about this period is that Gothic appears and disappears at different times in different places. By 1500, the Italian Renaissance is getting underway, but Gothic style is still alive and well in England and elsewhere in Europe. Here's the elaborate freestanding decorated Gothic tomb of King Edward II in Gloucester Cathedral, aka Hogwarts. Note how much these tombs resemble reliquaries, and they were visited with much the same passion. And here, finally, get it right this time, is the nave of Gloucester Cathedral. I've stated that English Gothic was more horizontal in its focus, so are you prepared to be completely confused? Late English Gothic style is known as perpendicular Gothic. To quote Wikipedia, my apologies, the interior of Gloucester Cathedral conveys an impression of a cage of stone and glass. I actually like that, which is why I quoted Wikipedia. Notice that there is less tracery, less ornate stonework, so the effect is more rectilinear. See how the nave has the look of a large rectangle, or really rectangular volume. The curves of the High French Gothic have given way to much more severe straight lines. I think rectilinear is actually a better term than perpendicular for this style, but perpendicular Gothic is the term art historians use more often, and so it's the one you're more likely to encounter on your AP test. Don't blame me. I would have called it something less confusing. Let's return now to the new BBC video for a look at some of the other famous English perpendicular Gothic cathedrals. This starts up right after a segment on the plague or Black Death. I'll return to that in a moment, but for now, just enjoy this glimpse of some of the more austere perpendicular Gothic churches built during this later Gothic period. And here's one of those useful summary slides, lightly edited. While German churches adopted rib vaults fairly early, otherwise they clung to the Romanesque for a century after Gothic art swept France. Germany's most famous Gothic cathedral is in Cologne. Note how similar the nave is to the cathedral at Amiens, which is shown in the upper right. The date here is misleading, by the way. The cathedral took 600 years to finish. On the other hand, it survived heavy bombing in World War II that took out, as you'll see, almost all of the newer buildings around it. It does rather suggest that those Gothic architects knew their business. As you might expect, all of the spectacular stained glass was blown out by bombs. In 2007, Cologne Cathedral finally got new stained glass windows created by a noted German artist. They're controversial since they're abstract. What do you think? I like them, but I like modern pictorial stained glass as well. And while I'm indulging myself, here are stained glass windows by one of my favorite 20th century artists, Marc Chagall, who was actually a Russian Jew. I find these incredibly moving. This is from Reims Cathedral. Here are 3 more Chagall windows from 3 different churches. Here we see Moses bringing back the 10 Commandments, the gift of the Holy Spirit, and Mary and Jesus. Wow, I love those. I've shown you hall churches before. It's a term that does show up on the AP test, so it'll be on your unit test. In hall churches, which are usually, though not always, found in Germany, the aisles are the same height as the nave, so there is no tribune, triforium, or clerestory. Here's an interior photo of the hall church of St. Elizabeth in Marburg, Germany. This makes the interior of the church bright and free-flowing. Here are 2 elevations that should give you a clearer understanding of the term hall church. Okay, that was quick, wasn't it? Here's another summary slide, this time of German Gothic architecture. French Gothic sculpture styles, as well as French Gothic architecture, traveled to Germany in the 13th century. Note the rippling drapery, the fairly clear delineation of anatomy under the garments, the emotionalism of many of the figures, and in general, the drama of the sculpture. And in fact, German sculpture is, if anything, more emotionally dramatic than French, and that's its most characteristic German element. These statues of the donors of this cathedral are not nearly as emotional, but they're still highly individualistic. More evidence of high Gothic humanism. Note especially the arm clearly outlined beneath Uda's cloak and how she's drawing it up to protect herself against a harsh German winter. Makes her really a much more real person. Well, I've mentioned the new confidence of the 12th and 13th centuries as the economy and the population grew, as towns and universities blossomed, as faith became both more triumphant and really more comforting. The 14th century, that's the 1300s, brought a terrible new wave of bubonic plague, which killed 1/3 of Europe's population, maybe 20 million people altogether. The death count was especially high in crowded towns and cities, which was a major setback for the urbanization, the move to towns and cities that had been driving high Gothic culture. In Paris, an estimated 800 people died each day in 1849. The death toll was also very high in monasteries, where people also lived in close quarters. And there was more good news. More bad news. The 100 Years' War between France and England devastated much of France. The church experienced its so-called Babylonian captivity when there were rival popes in Avignon and Rome. I'm sorry, I'm skipping over a lot of very interesting history way too fast. The Ottoman Turks conquered much of Eastern Europe and advanced on Vienna. And finally, this was a century of terrible climate change. In this case, it was global cooling, or what is sometimes known as the Little Ice Age. Temperatures dropped dramatically and widespread famine was one result as farms became less productive. This sculpture in many ways reflects the horrors of this century and the religious response. Gone, I think, is the self-confidence of high Gothic Christian humanism. Religious art, like ordinary life, was infused with the suffering as people sought to find meaning in the catastrophes that were assaulting them. Yet this statue also represents humanism taken to a new level. It shows more emotion, more movement, and above all, more freeing of sculpture from its architectural surroundings. By the way, this work is another AP favorite, one you should know. German Gothic artists excelled at metalwork, as this spectacular repoussé, remember that, altar demonstrates. Note the comparison with the early medieval bronze doors of Hildesheim, coming up now, another splendid example of German metalwork. Here's a detail from the altar showing Samson slaying the lion. The work, by the way, is gilded copper and enamel. Here's a reliquary, probably made by Nicholas of Verdun as well. It was believed to contain the relics of the three magi. Here's a detail from the reliquary made of silver and bronze with gemstone and natural and enamel decoration. Again, you get a feeling for how richly decorated these reliquaries were. In our whirlwind tour, we are on to Italy. This is probably the most famous Italian Gothic cathedral. So what French Gothic elements do you notice? Well, there are those pointed gables over the door. That's typical of the High Gothic. So are those elaborately carved pinnacles. But the carved painted ornamentation belongs more clearly to the Italian Renaissance. Here's one of those images. The coronation of the Virgin. It's a little blurry, sorry. So any guess as to the medium that the artist used? Mosaic. We're seeing Byzantine influence here. And here we see some seriously over-the-top Gothic decoration, including pinnacles. But the shape of the building really belongs more to the Renaissance, which is where we're now heading, to 14th century Italy and an art historical period that is sometimes called Italian Late Gothic and more often called Proto-Renaissance. But let's close, if you have time, with another practice AP question. None of you chose this question, which means you all get to tackle it. Notice that the College Board does not identify the statues and doesn't necessarily expect you to recognize them. You saw the first pair, our new buddies Ekkehard and Uda from a German cathedral and the High Gothic year of 1250. You actually haven't seen the others, at least on a slide, but you saw other statues from the same grouping. So any guesses as to who these are and where they are? They're kings and queens of the Old Testament from the royal portal at Chartres. See the crowns? It's quite typical of the College Board to choose an image that doesn't show up in most textbooks, but has a very recognizable style. So you aren't asked to identify the statues, but you are asked to identify the general art historical period, which is, of course, Gothic. The statement that the statues were made 100 years apart is a very significant clue, however, as is the word development, which suggests that the question is asking you to talk not only about common Gothic characteristics, but also about change over time. So take a minute now and try to write down 3 points that you could make in answering this essay. Well, I'm assuming, or at least hoping, that you've shared some of the points you've written down with the rest of the class and that Ms. Jacobs has handed out the scoring guidelines. I didn't get to hear that discussion, unfortunately, but in this slide I review some of the main points that are in the scoring guidelines. I'm hoping you'll have time to read 3 actual student essays and guess how each was scored, and then you'll have a chance to see how the scoring commentary actually played out and how well you predicted.